All right, buckle up. Today, we're cutting through the noise on one of the most tangled and tense geopolitical standoffs out there. We're talking about the triangular relationship involving Iran, Israel, and the United States. Our goal, as always, on the deep dive is to distill the absolute must-know insights from our research so you walk away truly informed.
Yeah, really get to the heart of it.
Exactly. Informed on a conflict that, well, it reverberates globally. We're going beyond the headlines here to understand the deep roots and the, frankly, surprising evolution of these tensions.
It really is fascinating how seemingly disparate historical events have converged, weaving together to create this ongoing dynamic. To truly grasp the present, you really have to journey back to a time when these relationships looked, well, almost entirely unrecognizable.
Absolutely. And that journey begins with a historical reality that might genuinely surprise many of you listening. Before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran was, believe it or not, one of the most pro-Western countries in the Middle East. This was under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. From Washington's perspective, Iran was seen as a key strategic partner, a vital stabilizing force even. But how did that deep alignment with the West, how did it initially solidify?
Well, that really dates back to the 1953 coup, famously known as Operation AX.
Ah, yes.
This was orchestrated by the CIA and British intelligence. Its primary goal, overthrow Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh.
Why?
Because he nationalized Iran's oil industry, a move that obviously ruffled feathers in Western capitals.
Big time.
The coup ultimately reinstated the Shah's absolute power and fundamentally aligned Iran with the U.S. and the U.K. From that point on, the Shah became a major Washington ally, receiving billions in aid, weapons, and critical intelligence support.
What's even more unexpected for many, I think, given current relations, is that this Western alignment wasn't just with the U.S. Pre-1979, Iran, an Islamic nation, actually recognized Israel de facto. Not officially, but de facto. How did that seemingly contradictory relationship function on the ground? Was it purely pragmatic?
It was primarily strategic, yes. Driven by shared concerns, particularly the rise of Arab nationalism and Soviet influence across the region.
Okay.
In an environment where many Arab countries were openly hostile toward Israel, Iran emerged as an unexpected yet crucial regional partner for the Jewish state.
How so? What did that look like practically?
Well, for instance, Iran supplied crude oil to Israel, and in return, Israel helped Iran develop its agriculture, its military technology, and its intelligence capabilities.
Okay.
There was actually a very close working relationship between Mossad, Israeli intelligence, and SAVAK, Iran's feared secret police.
Right.
They shared intelligence on Arab states, on internal threats, you name it.
And all of this was happening against the backdrop of the Cold War. So Washington clearly viewed Iran as this critical bulwark against Soviet expansion into the oil-rich Persian Gulf, especially with Iran bordering the Soviet Union to the north.
Precisely. The Shah positioned Iran as a modernizing force. He undertook sweeping reforms known as the White Revolution, economic, land, social initiatives, all aimed at westernizing and, importantly, secularizing the nation.
And the U.S. response.
The U.S. rewarded this loyalty by transforming Iran into one of its most heavily armed allies, selling billions of dollars worth of advanced American weaponry, fighter jets, radar systems, you name it. American military advisors, defense contractors, they operated freely within the country. It really cemented Iran's role as the quote-unquote policeman of the Gulf.
But as we often see with rapid modernization imposed from the top down, this deep alignment with the West, it eventually came at a significant cost, right? While maybe the elites and parts of the middle class thrived, resentment was definitely brewing among the poor, the religious conservatives, political dissidents.
Oh, absolutely.
They saw the Shah's regime as corrupt, authoritarian, and increasingly anti-Islamic. How deeply did this internal dissent really threaten the regime's stability, even when it looked so powerful externally?
It threatened it fundamentally. I mean, the revolution didn't come out of nowhere. It was fueled by years, decades really, of growing resentment against the Shah's rule. His government was seen as corrupt, repressive, and just deeply disconnected from the Islamic values held by a huge segment of the population.
And the repression.
Political repression by SAVAK was rampant, economic inequality was stark, there was cultural alienation, and crucially, the Shah's close ties with the U.S. and Israel were perceived by many as a profound betrayal, a betrayal of both Islamic and nationalist principles.
That simmering tension finally just boiled over in 1979. A pivotal moment, a truly seismic shift that didn't just overthrow the monarchy, it replaced it with a completely new system. an Islamic theocratic regime led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini.
Hmm.
The Shah fled in February 79 after months of mass protests. Just days later, Khomeini returns from exile, quickly consolidates power, and declares Iran an Islamic republic, governed by Sharia law.
And under this new regime, Iran's foreign policy took an immediate radical ideological turn. The U.S. and Israel, who were once allies, were now declared enemies of the Islamic Revolution.
Instantly.
Khomeini and his supporters famously branded the United States as the Great Satan and Israel as the Little Satan. And this wasn't just rhetoric, it was a real political rupture that immediately translated into policy.
And one of the most dramatic outcomes, something that really captured global headlines, was the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis in November 1979.
Yes, unforgettable.
Radical Iranian students stormed the embassy, took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage, held them for 444 days. The images, blindfolded Americans, angry mobs, they became iconic. A symbol of humiliation for the U.S., a huge blow to President Carter's presidency.
Absolutely.
Beyond that diplomatic rupture, what were the immediate and maybe more importantly, the long-term consequences of this massive shift?
The consequences were immediate, and they were incredibly long-lasting. Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Iran were severed, and they've never been fully restored, still haven't.
Right.
The U.S. imposed strict economic sanctions, froze Iranian assets. Israel's relationship with Iran just collapsed entirely. And Iran began actively supporting anti-Israel militant groups like Hezbollah and later Hamas. And the revolution also inspired Islamist movements across the region, challenging secular Arab regimes, alarming Western allies. It wasn't just a change in who ruled Iran. It completely redefined Iran's identity. It transformed Iran into a revolutionary Islamic state determined to resist American and Israeli influence. It truly rewrote the regional playbook, establishing a template for, asymmetric warfare and ideological confrontation that arguably still defines Middle East geopolitics.
That's a crucial point, how one event reshaped an entire region's strategic landscape. So following this seismic shift, Iran's foreign policy, as you said, transformed dramatically. From being Israel's strategic partner, Iran now emerged as one of its most vocal, most committed enemies. How did this new Islamic Republic articulate its stance against Israel? Ideologically, but also practically?
Well, the new regime just rejected the legitimacy of the State of Israel entirely. It adopted a firmly anti-Zionist and anti-Israel stance, rooted in both ideological and religious grounds.
So it wasn't just political?
No. Iran's leadership believed opposing Israel was a religious and moral obligation. They framed the struggle not just in political terms, but as a kind of holy cause, practically. They immediately closed the Israeli embassy in Tehran, replaced it with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO office.
Wow.
Iran's leaders began referring to Israel only as the Zionist regime, often vowing to see it wiped off the map. And these weren't just rhetorical flourishes. Tehran started actively supporting armed resistance against Israel.
So this hostility wasn't just talk. It materialized through concrete actions, support for various non-state actors fighting Israel. Can you walk us through the most significant of these proxies?
Yeah, absolutely. Most notably, Iran provided significant funding, weapons, training to Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Hezbollah, right.
Founded in the early 1980s with direct Iranian backing, Hezbollah quickly became one of Israel's most formidable enemies. Capable of rocket attacks, complex intelligence operations, sophisticated guerrilla warfare.
And beyond Lebanon.
Iran also became a major sponsor of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, in Gaza.
No, that's interesting because of the Sunni-Shia divide.
Exactly. Despite that traditional divide, Hamas and PIJ are Sunni. Iran supported these groups because of their shared goal, what they termed the liberation of Palestine. Iran provided smuggled weapons, financial aid, ideological encouragement. They've consistently fueled repeated conflicts between Gaza and Israel through this support.
And this all plays into what Iran calls its overarching axis of resistance strategy, correct? What exactly is this network, and how does it let Iran project power without necessarily fighting directly?
Yes, the axis of resistance. It's essentially an alliance of Iran-backed groups and governments dedicated to confronting Israel and U.S. influence in the region. It includes Hezbollah, Hamas, PIJ, various Shia militias in Iraq, the Assad regime in Syria, and more recently, the Houthis in Yemen.
So quite a network.
A significant network, and it allows Iran to challenge Israel indirectly through these proxies without engaging in full-scale conventional warfare. It's classic asymmetrical warfare. What's sort of fascinating in a grim way is how both both sides, despite the constant brinkmanship, seem to have implicitly understood and respected certain red lines for decades. It creates this terrifyingly stable equilibrium that paradoxically prevents all-out war while ensuring this perpetual low-intensity conflict.
That's a really insightful way to put it. A terrifyingly stable equilibrium. So how has Israel responded to this low-intensity proxy conflict, given Iran's strategic depth and reach through these groups?
Well, Israel, in turn, began targeting Iranian weapons shipments heading to these proxies, particularly Hezbollah. They targeted Hezbollah leaders, Iranian military positions in Syria. The goal was always to curb Iran's regional influence and deny it a permanent military foothold near Israeli borders. So basically, the post-1979 era marked the beginning of this ideologically driven, proxy-fueled Cold War between Iran and Israel. Their once covert alliance had morphed into this deeply entrenched regional rivalry,
Setting the stage for decades of covert attacks, assassinations, cyber warfare, military escalation.
exactly, across the entire Middle East.
And that deeply entrenched rivalry between Iran and Israel post-79, it couldn't exist in a vacuum, right? It was always intertwined with Tehran's equally volatile relationship with Washington. Let's delve into how that dynamic picked up steam, becoming one of the most enduring and frankly dangerous rivalries in modern international relations.
Yeah, this rivalry really intensified in the 1980s, particularly during the Iran-Iraq War. That was an 8-year conflict, 1980 to 1988. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, probably hoping to take advantage of the post-revolutionary chaos.
And the U.S. role.
Well, officially neutral, the U.S. definitely tilted toward Iraq. They provided intelligence, satellite imagery, even dual-use technology that could have military applications. The war was absolutely devastating, over 1 million lives lost, and it just entrenched Iranian hostility toward the U.S. even further, made it much deeper.
And there was even that tragic direct military skirmish during this period, the 1988 incident where the U.S. Navy mistakenly shot down Iran Air Flight 655,
Yes.
killing all 290 civilians on board.
A tragedy that, you're right, still resonates very deeply in Iranian memory today. Absolutely. Then moving into the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, the U.S. response was really one of sanctions and isolation. Iran was increasingly viewed as a primary threat. In 1995, President Bill Clinton imposed comprehensive economic sanctions on Iran, basically prohibiting American companies from investing in or trading with the country.
And the justification.
Washington accused Iran of sponsoring terrorism, particularly through Hezbollah, of undermining the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and crucially, of seeking to develop nuclear weapons.
And Iran's view.
Iran, for its part, consistently viewed these U.S. actions as efforts to isolate, weaken, and eventually overthrow the Islamic Republic. That was their narrative.
Then came the 2000s. President George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech, growing suspicion around Iran's nuclear program. It's worth noting, right, that although Iran wasn't directly involved in 9/11 and even cooperated briefly with the U.S. in Afghanistan afterwards, President Bush still included Iran in that infamous speech in 2002.
He did. And in that period, the U.S. accusations intensified, harboring terrorists, developing long-range missiles, and pursuing a secret nuclear weapons program.
Iran denied this, of course.
Iran consistently insisted its program was purely for peaceful energy purposes. However, revelations in 2002 about previously undisclosed nuclear facilities in Natanz and Iraq, well, that fueled international suspicion.
Why those specifically?
Because they hadn't been reported to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. That suggests they were hiding something.
Right.
And throughout the 2000s, U.S. intelligence agencies, often reportedly working with Israel, worked to sabotage Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Yeah.
We saw cyber attacks like the Stuxnet virus.
Stuxnet, yeah, that was huge.
A joint U.S.-Israeli operation, reportedly, that physically disrupted Iran's centrifuges used for uranium enrichment.
So we can definitely summarize this period as a kind of Cold War-style conflict, fought through proxies, economic pressure, covert ops, propaganda.
Absolutely. It created this perpetual state of tension and unpredictability. Diplomatic relations were basically non-existent. Economic sanctions were crippling Iran's economy. Military tensions were constantly simmering just below the surface.
And this sustained indirect conflict, it prevented any real normalization, didn't it?
Completely. And it laid the groundwork for the next major phase, the direct battle over Iran's nuclear future, which inevitably drew Israel in even more directly as both a U.S. ally and Iran's primary regional adversary.
And by the early 2000s, as you say, Iran's nuclear ambitions truly became the central flashpoint, driven by this profound fear, particularly in Israel and the U.S., that a nuclear-armed Iran would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Middle East and critically threaten the very existence of Israel.
The alarm bells truly started ringing loudly in 2002 with that revelation of the undeclared nuclear facilities in Natanz and Iraq. As we said, these hadn't been reported to the IAEA. That strongly suggested Iran was hiding key parts of its program, especially uranium enrichment, which is, a critical step towards potentially developing nuclear weapons.
And that sparked condemnation, diplomatic efforts.
Widespread condemnation, yeah. And immediate diplomatic efforts began.
But those negotiations throughout the 2000s between Iran and the EU3, France, Germany, the UK, they mostly stalled, didn't they? They were trying to persuade Iran to suspend enrichment.
They did stall, which led the U.S. and its allies, including Israel, to adopt this sort of two-pronged approach to contain Iran during this period.
Okay, what were the two prongs?
First, sanctions. Increasingly severe economic sanctions targeting Iran's banking sector, its oil exports, its international trade. These sanctions, later expanded by the UN Security Council, severely damaged Iran's economy, no question.
On the second prong.
Cyber and covert operations. We mentioned Stuxnet in 2010, destroying hundreds of centrifuges. But crucially also, several Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated.
Assassinated?
Yes, in operations widely believed to have been carried out by Israel's Mossad intelligence agency. Figures like Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in 2020 and multiple others between 2010 and 2012.
Wow. So really high stakes.
It's extremely high stakes.
All of this tension, this pressure, it finally led to what seemed like a major breakthrough in 2015, the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, brokered under President Obama with other world powers, the P5+1. What were the core elements of that agreement? How was it supposed to alleviate this nuclear flashpoint?
Well, the core idea was a trade-off. Iran agreed to significantly limit its nuclear program, limit uranium enrichment levels, drastically reduce the number of operating centrifuges, allow intensive IAEA inspections far beyond standard protocols, and eliminate its stockpile of higher enriched uranium.
And in return?
In return, international sanctions related to its nuclear program were lifted. This offered Iran significant economic relief and the chance to reintegrate into the global economy, access frozen assets, sell oil more freely.
However, there was very strong opposition, particularly from Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu famously called it a historic mistake, a dangerous mistake, arguing it only delayed the inevitable, didn't stop Iran's path to a bomb eventually, and that Iran would just use the sanctions relief to fund terrorism and its proxies.
Exactly. So the JCPOA was definitely a rare moment of diplomatic progress in this long saga, but it was inherently fragile from the start. Trust remained incredibly low on all sides. And the nuclear issue, despite the deal, remained the central, most sensitive flashpoint in this complex triangle. It really just kick the can down the road in some ways.
Which brings us inevitably to the modern sort of hair-trigger phase of U.S.-Iran confrontation, starting really in May 2018 with Washington's withdrawal from the JCPOA under President Trump and the reimposition of sanctions under the maximum pressure campaign. What was Iran's immediate response to the U.S. pulling out of the deal?
Iran responded with what analysts often call calibrated escalation. They didn't immediately rush to build a bomb, but they started taking gradual steps away from their JCPOA commitments, exceeding enrichment limits, installing more advanced centrifuges. Alongside this, they increased harassment of shipping in the Persian Gulf and stepped up proxy operations across the region. By mid-2019, you could really feel both sides were already flirting with open conflict. The deal's collapse just ramped everything up again.
And we saw some incredibly tense moments that year, 2019, illustrating just how close a miscalculation could have ignited a wider war. In June, Iran shot down a huge, expensive U.S. RQ-4 Global Hawk surveillance drone, claimed it violated Iranian airspace. The U.S. insisted it was in international waters.
Right.
This prompted President Trump to authorize retaliatory airstrikes and then, famously, abort them just minutes before launch.
Very close call.
And earlier that month, the U.S. blamed Iran for limpet mine attacks on oil tankers near the Gulf of Oman. It really seemed like the threshold for direct conflict was razor thin.
And then came the dramatic events of January 2020. A U.S. Reaper drone strike killed Major General Qasem Soleimani, the architect of Iran's entire regional proxy network, outside Baghdad airport. A huge figure.
Massive escalation.
Massive. 5 days later, Iran retaliated. They launched a volley of ballistic missiles at Al-Assad Air Base and Erbil in Iraq, where U.S. forces were stationed. While no Americans were killed, more than 100 U.S. personnel suffered traumatic brain injuries. This was significant. The first direct Iranian military strike on U.S. forces.
And then the tragic collateral damage.
Yes. Tragically, just hours later, amid the high alert and tension following the missile strikes, Iran's air defenses mistakenly shot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 near Tehran, killing all 176 civilians on board. A terrible tragedy stemming directly from that escalation.
And this sort of low-level war, this constant simmering tension, it just continued from 2020 through 2023, didn't it? Iranian commandos seizing or harassing commercial tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, covert cyber operations intensifying from both sides, pro-Iran militias in Iraq and Syria launching rockets and armed drones at American outposts, forcing periodic U.S. retaliatory strikes.
It became the new normal, this constant friction. And then the escalation continued from 2023 into 2024. The October 7, 2023, Hamas attack on Israel triggered a region-wide surge in Iran-backed activity. Proxies became much more active.
Right.
The most lethal proxy strike on U.S. troops came on January 28, 2024, at a base called Tower 22 in Jordan, near the Syrian border. Killed 3 American soldiers, injured dozens more.
That prompted a major U.S. response.
It did. President Biden vowed retaliation, and on February 2nd, U.S. B-1B bombers flew this incredibly long 44-hour mission from Texas. They unleashed 125 precision-guided munitions on 85 targets linked to Iran's IRGC and its affiliated militias across Iraq and Syria. It was Washington's largest single strike on Iranian proxies to date.
And speaking of that October 7th attack, the Gaza Strip really remains one of the most visible and certainly most violent flashpoints in the broader Iran-Israel conflict. How has Iran leveraged its influence there? And what makes that particular alliance, Hamas, PIJ, both Sunni groups, with Shia Iran so potent, despite the sectarian difference?
Well, since the early 1990s, and especially after Hamas took control of Gaza back in 2007, Iran has emerged as a really key backer for both Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And you're right, the Sunni-Shia divide is usually significant, but here, their alliance is based purely on that shared strategic goal. The destruction of Israel and what they call the liberation of Palestine. Ideology trumps theology in this case.
And the support is concrete.
Very concrete. Iran provides significant financial support, which is crucial given the blockade on Gaza. They provide weapons and training, often smuggled in. And critically, technological expertise helping them build more effective rockets, drones, and those extensive tunnel systems we hear so much about.
This Iranian influence has been strongly felt in all the major Gaza wars over the past couple of decades, hasn't it? Operation Cast Lead, Pillar of Defense, Protective Edge, the May 2021 conflict.
Absolutely. And what we've seen is how these conflicts have expanded really from being local, just Israel versus Hamas, to becoming regional flashpoints. They increasingly draw in Iran's broader network of allies. Hezbollah in Lebanon often threatens to open a second front during Gaza wars, forcing Israel to divide its attention and resources.
Right.
Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria have launched attacks toward Israel in solidarity. And the Houthis in Yemen, also backed by Iran, have launched long-range missiles and drones toward Israel during these conflicts.
So what stands out to you here? What's Iran's strategic calculus in fueling these conflicts?
Well, I think what stands out is Iran's calculated approach. These wars allow Iran to achieve several goals without risking a direct military clash with Israel or the U.S., which would be devastating for Iran. They bolster Iran's image as a leader of resistance across the Muslim world. They allow Iran and its proxies to test Israeli defense systems like Iron Dome. They drain Israel's military resources and put pressure on its society. And they help rally global opinion, particularly in the global south, against Israeli policies. It's a very calculated, indirect way to project power and pressure its adversaries.
This entire discussion, I mean, from the Shah's era right through to today's proxy conflicts and nuclear tensions, it really paints a picture of incredible complexity of volatility.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for the future? We've covered decades of tension, proxy wars, diplomatic standoffs. Where is this three-way conflict headed? Are there any clear paths forward, or are we just sort of caught in this dangerous loop?
Well, unfortunately, several persistent challenges make resolving this conflict extraordinarily difficult. It's not an easy puzzle. First, there's the deep ideological incompatibility. Iran's Islamic Republic, founded on revolutionary principles, maintains this strong anti-Israel, anti-U.S. ideology. They continue to view both countries as fundamentally existential enemies.
And Israel's perspective.
Israel naturally remains fiercely protective of its security and sovereignty, viewing Iran, especially a potentially nuclear Iran, as its primary existential threat. So very little common ground there.
Right.
Second, Iran's extensive proxy networks really complicate diplomacy. Tehran can often deny direct involvement while simultaneously using these groups to destabilize the region and attack its rivals, makes accountability very difficult. difficult.
The nuclear issue.
The nuclear ambitions remain a major point of contention. Even if a deal like the JCPOA were revived, the underlying suspicion and the breakout time concern would likely persist, raising global alarm.
And U.S. policy shifts.
That's another big factor. U.S. domestic politics and global policy shifts from administration to administration create uncertainty. It makes consistent long-term strategies very hard to maintain, both for allies and adversaries.
And the wider region.
Finally, the Middle East itself is deeply fractured. You have shifting alliances involving the Gulf states, Turkey, Russia, China. All these external players often have their own agendas that complicate resolution efforts.
Given all those challenges, what are the possible scenarios that experts are considering for the future? Is it just more of the same, this simmering conflict, or is there a genuine risk of something fundamentally different, maybe worse?
Well, experts usually outline a few key trajectories. The most likely status quo, unfortunately, is continued proxy conflicts, indirect confrontation. Both Iran and Israel and the U.S. probably want to avoid full-scale war because the consequences would be catastrophic for everyone. But this low-level conflict, the cyber attacks, the assassinations, the proxy battles that will likely persist.
Any hope for diplomacy?
There's always the possibility of negotiated diplomatic solutions, maybe a renewed effort to revive or replace the JCPOA. But this would require really significant compromises and, crucially, trust building on all sides, which seems like a monumental challenge right now.
And the downside risk.
The downside risk is definitely escalation into a wider war. The risk of miscalculation remains incredibly high.
Yeah.
An accidental strike, particularly a severe terrorist attack blamed on a proxy, maybe an Israeli preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. Any of these could potentially spiral out of control very quickly.
Involving the U.S. directly?
Almost certainly involving the U.S. and potentially engulfing other regional powers as well. That's the nightmare scenario.
Is there a best case, even if unlikely?
The long-term, maybe overly optimistic scenario is gradual de-escalation and normalization, perhaps driven by internal changes in Iran, changing economic needs, or shifts in regional dynamics. But that feels like a very slow, uncertain process, a long way off, if ever.
And the role of the international community in all of this. Can external players genuinely help mitigate these tensions, or are they just bystanders?
They're not just bystanders, but their influence is limited. The international community, the UN, European powers, other global institutions can play a vital role. Constructive engagement, multilateral diplomacy, consistent pressure for conflict resolution, providing platforms for dialogue. These things can help create space and reduce tensions. But it requires sustained, unified effort, and frankly, that unity has often been lacking, especially among the major powers.
What an incredible journey, though, going through the complex history and the ongoing, ever-shifting dynamics of this critical geopolitical triangle. It's just so clear that this is a conflict born out of a very specific set of historical circumstances that then spiraled into what we see today, constantly adapting to new regional and global pressures.
Absolutely, and the region, as a result, remains perpetually on a knife edge. As some of our sources highlight, any new direct confrontation with Iran could potentially put every single American facility in the Middle East on the menu, so to speak. The fear persists, and it's a realistic fear, that a localized incident, maybe another drone shoot-down, another tanker attack, another proxy strike, could accidentally escalate into the first direct U.S.-Iran war, a war that would almost certainly draw on Israel immediately and likely engulf the wider Middle East.
A truly sobering thought to end on, and this is exactly why it's so important for all of us to continue exploring, asking critical questions, and just remaining informed about these crucial global issues. We really hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of how this incredibly complex web of relationships, Iran, Israel, the U.S. came to be, and why it matters so much to all of us, wherever we are in the world.